Was listening with interest earlier, Senator Durbin and then Senator Carper talking about not only the bill in front of us, but I think there's a lot of merit, by the way, to address difficult subjects like infrastructure. I believe defense is the most important thing we need to do, and I generally have questions about that, why we don't do audits, why we don't adhere, especially to budgeting there, why we don't do budgets across the entirety of the federal government. I think, give or take, been 20 years since we've done one and have adhered to it. So, in looking at our infrastructure plan and the merits within it, everyone's going to find something that they like. And I'm talking about the $1.2 trillion infrastructure plan. I think probably for roads and bridges and a lot of that physical hard infrastructure, the need is even more than that. But Senator Carper, who used to run a state, I used to be on a school board in my hometown for 10 years, served as a state legislator with the intention of going there to do something on infrastructure in Indiana, the crossroads of America, living in the southern part of the state that has never had its fair share. And I think you need to be entrepreneurial through government in certain cases, especially at the local and state level, where you're accountable to where your entrepreneurialism through government, and I almost don't like to use that word because I've been a Main Street entrepreneur my entire life, and it's hard to use that as an analogous term to what we do here. Anyway, Senator Durbin was talking about, I think, more than just the content of the bill. I generally, whenever I'm coming down to vote for something, look at the principles that I know have worked in the real world. In building a business, in running a school board, local or state government, he referred to something that really caught my attention, and that inevitably, in times like these, we will then on our side revert to wanting to do a balanced budget amendment. Of course, I've been a proponent of that and term limits as well, not at the local and state level, but here. I don't think the founders ever intended us to grow a government like this, that for all the good intentions of policy that we want to put in place, to where we do it on the back of borrowing money and not doing it in a way that is painful, takes political will. Never forget, back in Indiana, 2017, 70% of Hoosiers wanted better infrastructure. We polled, 70% didn't want their taxes to go up. Fiscal conservative like me even got in trouble talking about paying for it, not borrowing the money, not pushing it down the road. At least there, you can make the argument you need a dedicated stream of payment for something that we most agree is essential. When you drive that point home, and when you took it through regular order, listen to this, nearly 2 to 2.5 months in a 3.5-month session, we ran it through Ways and Means Committee and Roads and Transportation. And by the time we were done, we had roughly 45 out of 47 witnesses, stakeholders, from the Manufacturing Association to the Farm Bureau to the Indiana Truckers Association, for it. We got people to buy in. And how did we do it? We did it with diesel and gas taxes. Some complained that we were raising taxes. It was in the context, though, in Indiana, of a balanced budget, rainy day funds. We've got one of the best business climates in the country. So it was within a system that was working. And I think what disturbed me listening a little bit ago is I agree with Senator Durbin. This is a shared blame in terms of how we've gotten here. My observation, building a business, frustrated each night when I'd come home, listen to the news, starting maybe roughly 2 decades or so ago, when we went from Democrat and Republican administrations that did believe in maybe having some political will. In other words, paying for the things we do here in a way that is not borrowing the money. And borrowing money sometimes is okay if it's a tangible asset. That's an investment. That kind of makes sense. And this has a little bit of that component as well. But in general, when you become a nation of consumption and spending, and you're putting it on display in a way like we have over several decades here, from the Gulf Wars to what we did in 08 and 09 looks like small change compared to what we're doing now. And I don't begrudge trying to get things done in an effective way. But I want the American public to be clear that when you borrow money to spend it or consume it, that has never ended up well in the long run. I read a book given to me by our friend Mike Enzi called The Empire of Debt. Actually, on that reading, it took a dismal subject, looked at it historically, put a little humor alongside it, because you need that to get through it to see how this all ends up. It's never worked well. If you are, by nature, spending and consuming and borrowing the money to do it, I did not need to be a finance guy from business school and have an economics degree from undergrad to know that that doesn't work. Even the folks that lean towards Keynesian economics, the Milton Friedman proponents that like to look at the money supply, no one, and even current liberal economists, are buying into this idea of the modern monetary theory. That, to me, just does not make sense. When I look at where we're at today, talking about infrastructure, which polls well because the American public knows we need it, but then when we dispense it in a way that's irresponsible in terms of how we pay for it, I couldn't have been for that from the get-go. And it was also inextricably linked to the $3.5 trillion of using a word like infrastructure, which we all know refers to tangible, and now trying to do it on stuff that isn't tangible. That's consumption. I think the merits of discussing child care, the high cost of post-secondary education, but we ought to do it like we did back in Indiana when we were talking about infrastructure. Run it through regular order, bring in experts and stakeholders across the country to buy into it. Here I see, and I used it just recently, if you try to be entrepreneurial through government, which I think is what's on display here, part of that equation is, yes, you got to take a little risk, you got to get it out there. But no one would put this much at stake and try to be entrepreneurial by borrowing the money. You'd be almost certain to fail, because in the real world, school board, local state government, especially in enterprise, you've got other rigors that won't let you do that. And you cannot count on a Fed, like since last year, has been accommodating and basically printing money in the basement by buying a lot of this debt, and is committed to do it even on this, as well as the major piece that's going to drop here in a few days. So, my concern is that maybe we as Republicans are a little slow-footed when it comes to engaging in real issues. I agree with Senator Durbin that we've been on this journey for a long time. That doesn't mean you double down and triple down and listen to this. I got here 2.5 years ago, roughly 18 trillion in debt. We're now roughly 28 trillion in debt, not including what we're going to do here on this hard infrastructure bill and the 3.5 trillion. All of it has merit for discussion. But if you spend money and consume it and borrow it without having the political will of doing what you have to do in any other entity, pay for it sustainably, it's not the foundation for this place or any entity. I want to give you a little description about what we do here currently. We spend $4.5 trillion a year. We take in revenues of $3.5 trillion. That's a chronic $1 trillion deficit. That's borrowing 23 cents roughly out of every dollar that you spend. And again, it's not for a tangible investment, it's for consumption. And now with what we're baselining into the future, that is going to go up close to 1.5 trillion. And we ought to be looking at what's driving the current dysfunction and try to get this place back into a solid footing rather than putting it in peril where history has shown this doesn't work out. Any country that's tried it has not had it work out. The Europeans, who have fashioned a system maybe a little bit erring on that side, have never had an economy that grows much more than 2%. And probably 4 or 5 years ago, when the euro and the European Union looked like it was working, you had some countries within it, Italy, Greece, Spain, Portugal, that showed that you couldn't do it. And then it threatened the integrity of the EU itself. The euro at that time was starting to become a reserve currency. It impacted them as well. They had to go through the hard medicine of getting back in line. So when we get through with this exercise, again, we're talking about something we need. But if we don't couch it in the discipline of having political will, in doing it to where it's going to be sustainable, and not to where it's going to put us even more in peril in terms of our federal balance sheet, it doesn't end up well for our kids and our grandkids. That's what worries me. End on 2 notes. We've got geopolitical competition. Senator Durbin mentioned that as well. The Chinese, even they have shed communism. They become almost expert state capitalists, have an authoritarian system. That'll probably be their limitation in the long run. If they'd ever liberalize their capital markets, or God forbid, their political system, you can't imagine the impact that would have on us and our currency. So they're playing the long game. They are savers and investors, and we got to be careful because they've at least realized that you can't replace the productive economy with a centralized system. And they're actually moving in a direction, sadly, with an authoritarian political system underlying it. One other place I'll use as an example. We should be looking at what is driving our $1 trillion deficits. He mentioned the Laffer curve. We were, pre-COVID, at a point where I think it's a sweet spot of where we needed to be. Wages were rising in the most difficult places. I, more than probably any other senator, since I'm the freshest off the street of a Main Street enterprise, there was a little company that grew into a national one over 37 years, basing it on having a conservative balance sheet, not to ruin your business by borrowing too much money, even when you have access to it. And here I see that same thing happening here. We will be outrun by our competitors that are long-term thinkers, that are investors, not spenders and consumers. And if we wanted to really right the ship, we ought to be tackling the high cost of health care. We all agree, I think, that that is a broken system. And one side of the aisle wants to dump more government into it by making it a one-payer system. What we ought to do first is reform the industry, like I did in my own company with health insurance, with a few simple principles. Made it consumer-driven to where every individual should be a health care consumer, not relying on your insurance that pays for everything from your employer, or the government doing it. That's given us a health care system that Warren Buffett cites as a tapeworm on our economy. We need something better, but we should have a common interest there. Make it transparent so we can shop for it like you do anything else, including a big screen TV, groceries. You have transparency. You can compete in terms of how you shop. That would work. If we did that with health insurance, with health care costs, we could start the process here, because Medicare that our elderly depend on goes broke in roughly 5 years. Automatic benefit cuts across the board. That's waiting to solve something once you're in a crisis. We ought to roll up our sleeves on it, on Social Security, and we need to quit turning discretionary spending, which requires budgeting, into mandatory spending, simply because we don't want to go through the rigor that any school board, state government, local government, or especially business would do to be successful in the long run. So I think we've got a bit of time that we could do this and maybe do it preemptively, or we can run this thing into the ditch. And for the people that love the federal government, want to grow it as a growth business, that are political entrepreneurs, I would think that side of the aisle would be especially concerned about its long-term health. And for those of us that always talk about it and then seem to be part of the same old thing that occurs each year, that's being a hypocrite, because we've gotten here not with one party driving us. Both have been in the vehicle that's ready to run us into the ditch. I yield the floor.